All right, welcome everyone. It's another Teen Science Cafe. We're excited to have you back. Let me just quickly share my screen. Although I want to get I hate when this happens. I want to open up my chat so I can see who's here. So as we do every week, for those of you who join us every week, type into the chat who you are, where you're from, because it's always good for the presenter. I recognize so many of you from all of the different weeks, so it's so nice to have you back with us, KL, and you too, Sterna. I'm going to trip over my tongue there. I know Wisteria and Cosimo are here, and Jack and Simon are here, so it's great to have you all with us. As we get going, I will pop into the chat in a moment. Can't actually do it right now. You know what, you guys? I'm going to stop screen sharing so I can get that into the chat, because I know some of you may need our live streaming. So here is the link. I just put it into the chat. If you need our live captioning today, just click on that link and you can have live captioning. So let me just get back to everything that we're talking about. Okay. Thank you for bearing with me. So if you need the live captioning, I just put the link into the chat. And then let me just remind you, when we're here in Teen Science Cafe on Zoom, all of you are muted, but that doesn't mean we do not want you to talk. And the way that you're going to do that is through the chat box and through the Q&A box. And so in the chat box, that's where you're going to share your thoughts and answer any questions our presenter will have for you. It's a way to have a back and forth with our presenter. Please make sure to stay on topic in the chat. We don't want the chat to become distracting. If you get off topic, it does end up being a distraction for other participants. Questions that you have for our presenter go in the Q&A box. And that's because you might have a question that pops up and it's not a good time for the presenter to take that question right away. So if we just load everything up in the Q&A box, we'll make sure to get to your questions when there's a good breaking point throughout the presentation. You all know we always make sure to answer every single question that comes in, and we'll do that again this time. So just be courteous and respectful to one another. Again, don't create any distractions that would be that would cause others to not be able to focus on today's presentation. So stay engaged. I know all of you participate fully, so I love it. So do what you always do. Ask lots of questions today. Engage with our presenter. We have a really good topic today. Before we get to today's presentation, I do want to let you know there's some new programs that have just popped up that you might be interested in. Some of these I've mentioned before, but some of them are new. We have a program where you can do some career exploration, and they're through what are called informational interviews. A person who has a job will present and talk about what their job is, and you have opportunities to ask questions and really learn about the job. So there's 3 coming up. There's one with a forensic investigator, one with a veterinarian, and one with the archivist from Burton Snowboards. So that is really cool if you want to explore those careers. We have a really neat opportunity called Critical Conversations coming up. It's a weekend program, but only part of the weekend, 4 to 6 on Saturday, and then again 4 to 6 on Sunday, the weekend of March 6th and 7th. And we're bringing in educators from Kentucky Extension to lead a program that is all about understanding how to have critical conversations about race, discrimination, implicit bias, and all of those tough things that we see going on in our world right now. And there's lots of conversations going on, and learning how to navigate them and facilitate those conversations is a really good skill to have. So I encourage you all to consider signing up for that. There is a program called Croak, Slither, and Slide. I know the current program that's about to start is full, but they're going to be offering a second program. So you can check that out. I don't think the second program's dates have been announced yet, but if you're interested in herpetology, then I would say kind of keep going and checking out to see when that gets announced. And then I will tell you, I just posted the spring series. So you can see all the topics that are going to start on March 31st through June 16th. We will take a break between our final cafe on March 17th from our winter series. So there'll be no cafe on March 24th. So there'll be a 1 week where we're not going to have a session, but then we have a really good lineup for the spring. Okay. Now, I also want to let you know that Maine has just started up their teen science cafes again, and they asked me to share with you. They have 2 announced already. Their cafes are Tuesdays at 4 p.m. And they have one coming up on March 2nd and then another one on the 9th. And I know that they're going to be posting more. So if you go to the website that's listed, and I'll get this into the chat so you have that. But I just want to let you know that you have other opportunities to attend teen science cafes, not just here through Vermont. All right, so let's get to today's presentation. Today, we're going to be learning about endangered crops of Vermont with Professor Eric von Wettberg. So let me tell you a little bit about him. So Professor von Wettberg is with UVM's Department of Plant and Soil Science and the Gund Institute for the Environment. And he teaches courses on preserving crop genetic diversity and plant science. His research aims to preserve crop varieties with international gene banks and local seed saving groups as partners. Other work in his group aims to understand how plants can contribute to the sequestration of carbon in soils as a means of addressing climate change. And this is, I think, my favorite part. He has recently worked all around the world in India, Ethiopia, Malawi, Russia, Taiwan, China, in Turkey, and his favorite crops are chickpeas, lentils, peas, and beans. So let's welcome Professor Eric von Wettberg, and let's get ready to learn about crops.
Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to meet all of you virtually. I'm going to share my screen now. And let's make sure we can see my slideshow. You can see it, Lauren? Okay. Well, let's hope my internet holds up here. It's a pleasure to have all of you today. I'm really excited to talk about some of my favorite crops and other things. So we're going to talk about some of the diversity you might find in your kitchen, your garden, at the supermarket, at the farmer's market. I'd like to start by introducing myself. And as Lauren said, I do have a really cool job. I have been able to travel an awful lot around the world doing what I do. So this is a map that is on the wall behind me. I actually have 2 of them. I have one in my office as well, because I'm very curious about the world, and I've been very lucky to see a lot of it. I got to spend a month in China. I lived in Denmark for 1.5 years. This is me back when I was in college with much more hair. I had what may be the best job I would ever have then, where I spent a summer sitting on a beach in Greece watching bees nest in the ground. I got to live in Denmark after that, but we've really been focusing on how the world is going to change due to climate change. And a key part of that is having variation in the crops that we grow, that we eat. So yeah, this is a little bit about me. I guess until 3 years ago, we lived in Miami. I taught at another university in South Florida. Before that, I lived in California for a while. And I was a PhD student in Rhode Island. Let me ask you a question. So I have the chat up here. Hopefully it doesn't block your view of my screen too much. I'd like to hear in the chat what some of you think crop diversity is. what does it mean to have diversity in crops? I'm going to pause for a second to let you type into the chat.
Yes, there's always a delay, but I know these guys are typing away.
Awkward silences.
So Alice says the opposite of monoculture. Simon says crop subtypes. Sterna says genetic variations from the same species.
These are all good answers in what we mean by crop genetic diversity. We can have multiple species in our field. So in the US, we frequently grow just one crop in a field at a time. We have a field full of corn, or we have a field full of hemp, increasingly here in Vermont. In many places, people will instead grow a mixture. If you see a pasture, that is often a mixture of different species. It might have alfalfa and grasses and clovers and other things in it. We can also have diversity, as several of you mentioned, within a crop species. And that is what we mean by a crop variety. We have a couple words for describing the diversity within a crop. One is to call it a variety. I may at other times call it genetic variation. They mean slightly different things, but they're a variety is usually something that somebody has bothered to name, and the genetic diversity may be hidden, or there may even be genetic diversity within a variety where they're more like brothers and sisters that are very similar, but not quite the same. So the varieties you're most likely to recognize are these here. Many of us recognize apple varieties. In some other crops, we don't sell them quite as often. But in the chat, I want to see if you can name some other varieties, be it of apples or other crops. I'm curious which ones you might be familiar with. I've given here some of the more common apples, but I would love to, I'm very curious to know what varieties you recognize. So I will wait for a minute in the chat.
So Sage says snapdragon. Sterna says cherry tomatoes. Simon and Jack say golden delicious and Fuji.
Yep. The Snapdragon peas are one of my favorite. They've got, I love the crispness of the pod. Cherry tomatoes are a great one. When we lived in Miami, you can grow tomatoes the whole year round outdoors, but it gets so hot in the summer in South Florida that a big tomato will crack. So there's a tiny little cherry tomato called the Everglades tomato that is just so intensely flavored. And the Golden Delicious and Fuji are great examples. So in apples, different people like different things. So I'm going to stop for another short question here. Many of us are familiar with apples. I'd love to see what some of your favorite apples are while I talk about some of the things people like in the 4 apples I have here. So in some parts of the world, particularly in Italy, they don't think a red apple is perfect. They think an apple should have stripes. So this yellow color on the top of it in the Italian apple market is much preferred. I can't explain why. People just like different things, but Italians love, well, Simon, I'm sorry to hear apples make you sick. That's everyone, all of us taste differently. So that is perfectly fine. Many of the apples we have are quite bitter. Granny Smith is sort of like that, or a little bit sour. Let's see. Jack says Gala and Zestar. I'm not even sure I recognize the Zestar. That's a good one. Wait another minute to see if we have any Granny Smith. That's a good one. You like the tartness, Lauren.
Yes, I only like those tart apples. Like I can tolerate sort of a regular apple, but if I'm gonna buy them from the store, I only buy Granny Smith. So anyone else have a favorite apple? Put it in the chat.
And while you're thinking about that, I have another quick question for you. So, do you think all crops have varieties? Um, I've shown another crop that you might recognize having distinct varieties. So Simon says yes. So yes, nearly all crops have varieties. There are some where they're grown so rarely that nobody has bothered to name them, but there's almost always some variation in a crop species. There are a handful of species that, well, there are differences in how different crops reproduce. So part of the reason we know so much about apple varieties is that we can usually graft apples. So the roots, what we call the stalk, is usually a different apple than the top of the tree. So we actually graft. We cut the stem and we put it on top of the roots to get a better tasting apple on a stronger root system. And because apples do that, you can keep the same apple over and over. In the case of Red Delicious, it was actually a sport or a mutation that occurred in one farmer's field. He put up a fence because people liked it so much so that people wouldn't come and steal it. But there are some other crops where there's few enough grown that simply nobody has named them. So I'm going to look in the Q&A here for a second, see if we have another question. So the question is, do bananas have variety? And that's a great question. Bananas are a good example because the banana fruit doesn't have seeds, but we do have banana varieties. There's nearly 1,000 different varieties of bananas. When we lived in South Florida, we grew 5 different ones in our yard, some really small ones, some bigger ones, one that turned red as it got ripe, and another that's bananas and plantains are the same species, but they taste very different. So we had a plantain as well that we would fry and eat as a savory dish. All right, so I've been probing a little bit about crop varieties, and I'd like you to think about some others that you might see. So I'd like you to think about your pantry or the grocery store or a farmer's market, and think about the beans or the peppers or some of the other fruits, and think about some of the varieties you've seen. So I'd like to probe a little bit farther and hear more about what comes to mind for all of you. And while you're doing that, we can take a look at my beans as well. Yep. So wisteria and maybe Cosimo, note the pinto and orca beans. These beans here, these are a mix of different ones. This is from a colleague's photo from, I believe, from South America. So there are, many of these are kidney beans, but they're speckled. So a bean we have here that I'll talk about in a little bit is actually called Jacob's cattle beans. And there's a story associated with them, that they were a gift from the Passamaquoddy, one of the Abenaki groups of Maine, to the first British, or now Euro-American family in Maine, and that they've been passed down in that family to today. These yellow beans, they're still sort of the kidney bean type, but you can see they're pigmented very differently with a richer set of carotenoids. let's see, we've got black and kidney and monk beans. Let's see, potatoes and rice. Those are great examples as well. I'm going to come back to potatoes in a little bit from the chat because variation in potatoes is one of the, gives us a historical example that's worth mentioning. All right, let me move forward a little bit. So I mentioned some of the Abenaki beans, and one of the things we do in my laboratory group is work to characterize and protect the genetic diversity within crops. So the 19 different types of beans that I have pictured here were collected by my friend, my teacher, and my colleague, Dr. Fred Wiseman. He used to teach at Johnson State and is the founder of the Seeds of Renewal Project, which is hosted by the Vermont Indigenous Heritage Center. He's of Abenaki heritage, and he collected these 19 beans from different farms and other places around Vermont and New England. And you can see there's a lot of diversity in these beans. They're colorful, from this white to the speckled Jacob's cattle bean to more of the yellow, and it doesn't show up really well around the image, but the main yellow-eyed bean. These beans, the bean itself looks different in some of these. It's quite flat in the Dolof beans. Some of these are bush beans, some are pole beans, so they grow in different ways. One of these that is named the king of the early beans. This one flowers and produces pods very quickly. So in times when the climate used to be colder, that bean did very well. The Norwich walk bean is also worth mentioning for a second because it was found on the Kennebec River in Maine and just below the village of Norwich Walk. And in 1724, there was a massacre of the village by the British settlers. And a few years later, the bean was found nearby, having survived the catastrophe that had happened in Norwich Walk. So it's a reminder, as well as part of the cultural heritage that we had. All right, so some of the work that we do, and this is work that a UVM undergraduate student named Beck did, they extracted the DNA from these seeds and we sent them off to be sequenced so that we could determine how different they are from one another. We also wanted to ask whether they were more similar to beans that we find in Europe or in Mexico or in Peru, because there's an amazing diversity of beans everywhere we look. All right, so I want to shift my question a little bit, probe deeper. So I'd like to see more thoughts in the chat on why you think we have a diversity of crops. Why might this diversity be important to us? While we do that, I'm going to get a drink of water that I think I have right. No. I thought I had one behind me.
So I know earlier when you asked about the what is crop diversity, someone said it's not monoculture. So why would you think having diversity is more important than that single crop? Or and I see Kale put withstanding climate change, and Alice said land is not meant to be inhabited by one plant.
Yeah, so these are two excellent parts of the answer. There are multiple answers.
Yeah, Wisteria said, people have different taste and also insect resistance. Sterna says genetic mutations that helped the crop or was desirable was kept and grow into a variety.
Yeah, so until the last about 100 years. The first seed companies arose just before the Napoleonic Wars. Until seed companies came around, most people grew seeds that they themselves had collected or came from their village or their family. And many crops reproduce sexually, even those that don't. If we take something like an apple, it does make a seed, but because we can graft it, we can vegetatively reproduce it. When a mutation happens, if it makes it a different color, we can decide to keep it. So in something like the beans that I've been showing, people like them because they may take a different amount of time to cook. They do differ in which insects eat them a little bit. And for Jack's, or Jack and Simon's answer, they do differ in their resistance to insects, to diseases. Crops get diseases just like people do. And in their in how they respond to climate change. So there's one very famous example. I haven't put in a picture because it's a sad history, but in the 1840s, much of Ireland, the most important crop was the potato. And a pathogen, an oomycete, blight, came in from Peru, where potatoes originated, and only 5 distinct potatoes had originally gone from Peru to Europe. Yet that basically one potato, it was called the lumper, was accounted for about 70% of the diet of Ireland or more in many families. And the pathogen knocked out so much of the Irish population that 1 million people perished. Several million more moved to North America, to the US, to Canada, to Australia. And to this day, Ireland is perhaps the only country that has fewer people today than it did in 1840 because of how terrible the potato famine was. It was an immense catastrophe, and had there been more diversity of potatoes, it wouldn't have happened. And yes, it's a famous example, and as Sterna indicates in the chat, there are deeper causes to it. Politics mattered as well, and I'll avoid that. Let's see. Are there other answers here? Lauren, did I miss the, there was something that popped up in the Q&A and has disappeared.
Yes, we can address that question later.
Okay. So we've talked about some of the reasons we have different varieties. In things like apples, Lauren really likes the Granny Smith. I happen to be a fan of the Fuji and the Gala. There are, in many cases, different conditions where the crop grows. So in the picture I have behind me, let me move the chat for a moment. These are 2 different types of chickpea. Here in the US, we mostly have this light colored, bigger seeded one. So when you have hummus, or if you have falafel, it's usually made this way. In India and Ethiopia, where they consume far more chickpeas than we do, they don't usually eat falafel or hummus. In India, they will make breads or samosas with chickpeas that they've ground into a flour, or they will use it as dal, a type of curry. Absolutely delicious. In Ethiopia, they use it for a dish called, oh shoot, I'm forgetting it. It's my favorite Ethiopian dish. How am I forgetting the name of it? This is embarrassing. I love Ethiopian food. I've been to Ethiopia 6 times. The people, the food is amazing. This darker colored chickpea is a little bit more bitter. In hummus, it may not be as good, but in Ethiopian dishes and in Indian dishes, this one tastes much better. So when we go to restaurants here in the US, it tastes close to the same, but there are flavors that one can only get in India. And this is part of the cultural differences that make us interesting, that make food fascinating, that should make us all want to travel when we're allowed to again and can do so safely. All right. So much of what worries me, in part because of the history of the potato famine that I mentioned, is that some of the varieties we have become less common than they used to be. So I'm going to move the video here so you can see some of the amazing diversity of apples in North America. Johnny Appleseed, we have in legends, but Johnny Appleseed was a real person. Apples were not native to North America. When the Pilgrims or Columbus before them arrived in the Americas, apples were restricted to Europe and China. They're a Eurasian crop. But the early settlers brought apples with them to the Americas. And although apples had been largely planted and grafted for about 4,000 years, when the early settlers arrived in the Americas, many of them went to seed. And when they went to seed, they began recombining. They had, when they went to seed, they did not stay true to type. And all this diversity arose that gave us incredible variation in apples, some of which are much sweeter than apples that had been known in Europe before. This diversity arose, but now we grow many fewer apples. If you go to the supermarket, we have a few that happen to ship well. Although Vermont can produce lots of apples, we still get many of our apples from Washington State, or even sometimes from New Zealand and Chile. And apples like the Fuji, the Red Delicious, and the Gala, they handle shipping much better than other apples like the Macintosh that can be absolutely delicious when fresh, but as some of you noted in the chat, can become quite mushy. So as the way we get our food changes, some of these varieties have become less common. And this worries me because just like we can lose endangered species, we can have endangered crop varieties. And one of the things we've been studying is endangered crop varieties of New England. So I showed the Abenaki beans, but there are other Abenaki varieties that are among our most endangered. In particular, for those of you in central Vermont, there's one called the East Montpelier squash that may be our most endangered squash. Now, there is a plan to deal with this, and I'm going to jump to that. This behind me is a gene bank. I'm going to open up the chat again to ask you, what do I mean by a gene bank? What is a gene bank?
I know I need the Jeopardy music for this. So Kale says the places to store lots and lots of seeds. Simon also says a place with a seed for every crop. Yep. Stana says a place where genetics are stored.
And all of those are correct. So the gene bank I have in this picture, which is on the island of Svalbard in the Arctic Ocean far north of Norway, is perhaps the world's most famous gene bank because it was built, some people call it the Doomsday Vault, and it was built to be a backup gene bank to other gene banks. And the idea is that seeds or propagules of plants are stored there, and that it holds the varieties in case they're lost elsewhere. So it is very much like another word for it that would be perfectly acceptable is seed bank. But the idea is that it's a repository of genetic diversity. Now, this is not the only gene bank. I have another one behind me. This is the Russian gene bank. And part of the reason I have been able to travel so much is that I work with a number of gene banks. This is a famous one. This one is maybe a little bit less famous than the one in Norway, but it's famous for a reason. It's on the central square of St. Petersburg. This is St. Isaac's Square. That's one of the Russian czars featured there. Peter the Great, there's another statue of him nearby, pointing to the Neva River, where he built what was then the Russian Empire's navy. St. Petersburg is an amazing, beautiful city. In the Second World War, however, it was under siege for 900 days. For nearly 3 years, it was surrounded. And unfortunately, I have to tell the history, one has to talk about unfortunate things that happened. During the 900-day siege, at least 1 million people perished in what was then Leningrad. Because it was under siege, no food came in. And the gene bank in this building had all the seeds of different crops. And the staff of the Institute locked the doors and they stayed inside for 3 years protecting the seeds. They would go out to eat if they could find anything. They released recipes for using weeds. There's a garden to the left of this near St. Isaac's Cathedral, where they actually planted beets and cabbage. But by the end of the war, 11 of them had starved to death. And they did this willingly to save the seeds for other Russians after them. So these they saw these as essential to saving the genetic diversity that we might need in case they weren't thinking of climate change then, but in case of climate change, in case of new diseases. If I go back for a second, we may think that this is, well, I have my picture here is of several of my favorite gene banks. So in the upper right is inside the Russian gene bank while we were doing a tour. Below are the Ethiopian gene bank and the staff of the Ethiopian gene bank who I was working with to make their facility more efficient. The third one here, or the last one in the upper left-hand corner, this one has also been in the news the last few years. There was a gene bank in Syria, and during the Syrian civil war, ISIS overran the gene bank, and they set up their headquarters at the gene bank outside of Aleppo. The seeds were lost. They were able to rebuild their gene bank. Now this is not me taking a picture in Syria. I have not been to Syria, but they moved the gene bank to Morocco, where conditions are currently much better, and they rebuilt a new gene bank. Where do you think they got the seeds from? Any guesses? If they couldn't get them from Syria, is there a backup someplace they might be able to use?
Stana says plants, and Kale says Russia.
So getting them from plants might, collecting new ones in some cases would be an option. So they actually got them from the Svalbard Gene Bank in Norway. So they had deposited their collection here in the Arctic, on an island in the Arctic Ocean. And when the gene bank was destroyed, they were able to repopulate it in its form in Morocco. So the Svalbard gene bank worked. All right, so yeah, so I've been able to visit a lot of different gene banks. Fascinating places. They're usually kept very cold. So they'll often give you a coat and gloves when you go in. It's like being in Vermont all the time. Now, gene banks are part of the answer, but I don't want to leave you with the impression that they are enough to protect genetic diversity. In the end, we are the ones who eat that diversity. For those of us who garden, and we all rely on farmers, they're the ones who grow them. So since crop varieties often indicate our cultural heritage, our preferences, a preference for Granny Smith versus Gala, or a clementine versus a mandarin, it's the people who have them. So some of the other work we do is working with people who save their seeds locally. So I'm going to turn to the chat again and see if you garden. I'm curious in learning more about what you might grow, and if you save your own seeds, and if you know what they are. And if you don't, thinking about ways you might support the range of diversity. And while that question is going, I will put this slide back up to remind you.
Sharna says she's a new gardener. That's exciting.
That is exciting. So one of the resources we have for new gardeners, particularly in Vermont, but this is not just a Vermont thing, is some of our public libraries have seed libraries along with the books, with the idea that people can take out some of the seeds. Many of those seeds are donated from companies like High Mowing or Johnny's, some of our local New England smaller seed companies. One of the things, but there are also groups that are of seed savers. So for some things that might not be easy to keep in a gene bank, there are groups like the Seed Savers Exchange that hold on to the diversity of a range of crops. So Simon says, we don't save our seeds. You know, to be honest, Simon, I grew up gardening in upstate New York, where I grew up in Hamilton, where Colgate University is. And we grew most of our own food, but we rarely saved our own seeds. But I think I have managed to convince my own parents that they should start saving their seeds over time. One of the things, I haven't put in a slide for this, but one of the things if you've been following the news over the past year, we're about a year into COVID. Around April of last year, there was a run on seeds, just at the point where people stopped hoarding toilet paper. They began hoarding seeds, and it became hard to find seeds of different things. And one of saving your own seeds is a way to avoid that, but it can be more than that. If your grandmother has a bean that she really likes, you can save it. Beans and peas happen to be really good ones. Sunflowers are as well. There are some that are harder. Corn is a little bit more difficult. I think my slide before, or the slides I had at the beginning, show that corn tends to outcross. And because it outcrosses, if somebody else nearby within a mile is growing a different corn than you, you're going to end up with something that's mixed. So you have to try a little bit harder with corn, but many crops are very easy to save. Even tomatoes or cucumbers, you have to dry the seeds to be sure the seeds don't grow mold, but they're very easily saved. Now in our virtual setting, I can't really teach seed saving, but I'm hoping to see many of you at UVM in the future. And this is one of the things that I teach in my courses. All right. So I hope I have intrigued you with some of the diversity of crops and some of the things we do to save them. Let's see.
I don't know if you just saw Ezra's comment. Ezra says, I live on a farm and we grow quite a few things like broccoli, peppers, tomatoes, corn, cabbage, various greens like lettuce, spinach, kale. They don't save their own seeds, though we buy them from catalogs like Johnny's.
Let's see. So the last thing I wanted to go looking for, I think I missed a question in the Q&A unless I hit it along the way.
No, we'll get to we can get to the questions at the end.
Well, I have gone a little bit more quickly than I intended to, but I've gone through the slides that I had prepared ahead of time.
Oh, okay. So let me pop up a poll. So for the just knowledge base, you guys have been here before. Just quickly answer the poll, 1 to 5 rating, and then 1 to 5, you know, what you learned, and then we'll get into the questions. Keep putting your questions into the Q&A box. I know I have a couple, but I'll just ask them afterwards. And then we'll get to the questions in a moment. Okay, I think that is everyone. Okay, so our first question is from Sterna. What is apple grafting?
All right, that's a great question. I love that question. We wrote a recent paper on grafting. So the idea is that you can think of the roots of a plant as pipes. They are more than pipes, but they kind of act like pipes that carry water and nutrients up to the top and then carry sugars and other things back down to the roots to feed them. Plants, we have known for at least 4,000 years that you can graft one plant onto another if they're the same species, sometimes even if they're closely related. So the idea is you cut the stem of probably the easiest plant to do this with is a hibiscus. You cut the stem of a hibiscus that has a colored flower that you like, and then you cut the stem of the roots, or you leave another hibiscus rooted. And ideally the two are about the same size, and you line them up so that the outside of the two matches each other. And then ideally you put some wax around it, and that allows water to continue to move. And both the top and the bottom will keep growing and they'll fuse together. So if you go to an apple orchard, you can sometimes find the graft union, the spot where they were actually grafted to each other, and it'll often be a bump. Sometimes you can tell because at the bottom there are leaves that look different than the leaves at the top. When people do it in roses, you'll sometimes see a multicolored rose. In apples or things like peaches, apricots, nectarines that are all closely related to one another, you can actually have a tree that has peaches, plums, apricots, and nectarines all on the same tree. And you do that by grafting different branches to the same base or the same stock. You can have multiple types of apples on the same tree the same way. Or if you're in Miami, you can have 3 or 4 different kinds of mangoes on the same tree.
Nice. KL wants to know, are there gene banks in the US?
There are. We, in fact, have one of the world's best and most important gene banks. The USDA system is called there's a digital part of it called GRIN, Genetic Resources Information Network. We have a whole system of gene banks. When I lived in Miami, I worked in part at the garden of David Fairchild. So David Fairchild was in the very early 1900s, was the head of the US Plant Introduction Service. So if you go to Washington, DC, the cherry trees in spring are ones that he planted. He arranged to bring in from Japan. If you have orange juice in the morning, the citrus or the oranges that are famous in Florida were brought in by in part by Fairchild. Mangoes from South Florida, he brought in many. And if you have meat, in many cases, that animal has been fed soybeans, or many of our foods have soybean or soybean oil in them. And he's the person who introduced soybeans and studied them from China, or he led the effort to do that. When he was introducing all of these things, a network of gene banks were built. So we actually have about 10 different ones in the USDA system. The headquarters are in Colorado, but there's one in Geneva, New York that has the US apple collection. There's one in Pullman, Washington, where Washington State is, that has the chickpea collection. There's one in Georgia that has the peanut collection. There's one in Iowa that, of course, has the corn collection.
Nice. So just to jump off of that, are most seed banks specialized, or are some of them mixing a lot of things?
Many of them have a mix of things. So in naming those gene banks, they have the most famous things. There are some gene banks that specialize in things that we don't really store as seeds. So in Miami and Hawaii and Puerto Rico, part of that network has a living gene bank where they keep the chocolate collection, the banana collection, the mango collection. So in all of those cases, they can't be effectively stored as seeds, so they have them as a living gene bank.
Oh, okay.
I nearly got arrested when I lived in Denmark because I would go into the apple collection and all the apples were on the ground, and I got in trouble for taking ground apples. I was a very poor student, and I thought it made it okay, but it did not.
Right.
It was a national resource, and I deserved to get in trouble for that.
So Sterna wants to know, how do you save tomato seeds?
So the way I like to do it is I'm going to enjoy the tomato. So as I cut it open, the seeds are inside, and I will just press them onto a paper towel and leave them out on the windowsill to dry off. When they're dry enough that they come easily off of the paper towel, then I will move them to a coin envelope and keep them stored there. You can let the tomato become a little bit too ripe, and then the seeds tend to have a higher germination rate. But even if you don't get even if you eat the tomato when it looks best, rather than waiting for it to be overripe, you can still get a viable seed with a good germination out of the tomato that way. So all it takes is a little bit of paper towels to remove the mess.
Nice. So I have two questions, and guys, if you have any other questions, put them in the Q&A, but I'll ask mine at this point. With seed banks, you said that the Syrian seed bank got moved to Morocco and they got the backups from the Norway. So do they then have to grow and actually germinate those seeds to then put a deposit back into Norway?
Yep, they did. So for a seed like a chickpea or a wheat or a corn, what the rest of the world calls maize, those seeds can be stored, if you make it cold and very dry, for nearly 50 years in a gene bank. But to save space, because it's expensive to refrigerate that many seeds, they'll usually put maybe 30 seeds of a variety into the vault. So if you want to distribute them, if you want to let farmers use them, you have to grow those 30 seeds, collect the seeds from them, and probably do it 2 or 3 more times. And because there are millions of varieties in Svalbard, to amplify all of them and to make sure it doesn't wait 50 years and then have to do a massive area, every year they will grow out a few. So they have fields outside of Rabat where they grew the wheats and the lentils and peas that they had in that gene bank so that they could regenerate them.
Okay. And then my other question is, I've heard the term like heirloom seeds or heirloom variety. What does that have something to do with this diversity
It
that you're
does.
trying to
It
maintain?
does. And I to try to not spend too much time on jargon, I avoided that, but it's important to understand what they are. We think of something called a land race. It's another piece of jargon, which is something that a village would have had and passed down in the village. Starting maybe 200 years ago, people realized that they could sell seeds effectively. And many people started naming the seeds they had. In some cases, they might have been named after the village or somebody's girlfriend or just the trait of the seed. The first sweet corn that was commercially released was called Golden Bantam. And, described the color and that it was sort of like a young, energetic chicken. Um, but so the heirloom names often have a little bit of advertising in them, but in some cases, like Jacob's cattle bean, it has a biblical connotation to it that it is meant to describe what the bean looks like. Heirloom means that it's older and that it had it most likely did not originate from a university or a government or a corporate breeding program, that it arose on its own, or maybe that a hobbyist or a farmer made the crosses or selected it. While we sometimes distinguish heirlooms from modern varieties, and those have usually been created by someone like me, a scientific breeder who either works for a university, a government, or more often a private company.
Great. Well, thank you for that. At this point, we don't have any other questions that have come in. So I would like to thank you so much for sharing what you do with everyone and educating us on the importance of crop diversity. Hopefully you might have some budding, pun intended, plant scientists that will join you at the university in a couple of years. So everyone, I see everyone saying thank you in the chat. So yes, thank you. And yeah, I think we'll all look at our food a little bit differently now.
Well, thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure to spend the afternoon with you.